Thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Lisa Millette and I am a project management specialist at RTI International and I will be your host today. Before we get started, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items for you. If you need technical support, please let us know through the chat window or by emailing us at sakitta@rti.org. If you have any questions regarding today's material, please type them into the chat window and we will retain them for the Q&A session, which will be held at the end of the presentation. We will archive this webinar within a few business days, and we will also send out an email to all who have registered with the announcement. It'll include a PDF copy of today's presentation, and you can also view all of our archived webinars on the Saki TTA website under the Webinars section. This is the webinar, Foundations for Investigation, Cold Case Sexual Assault, presented by Jim Markey. This project was awarded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and points or views or opinions in this document are those of the author and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of the U.S. Department of Justice. Jim Markey is a senior law enforcement specialist in the Investigative Science Program at RTI International, and he provides direct consultation and training and technical assistance for 64 Sexual Assault Kit Initiative grantees nationwide. Mr. Markey served 30 years with the Phoenix, Arizona Police Department, rising from patrolman to supervisor. For 14 years, he led the Adult Sex Crime Unit, the first detective unit to work in a multidisciplinary team. The team comprised at least 10 investigators and investigated more than 7,000 sexual assaults, including over 100 serial rape cases. Mr. Markey's work included regular meetings with internal and external partners to develop policy, conduct regular meetings, and openly communicate on a variety of issues involving violence against women. He received more than 30 commendations, including the Police Chiefs Unit Award and the Distinguished Service Award. And without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and pass it off to Jim.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And I really appreciate the support, the technical support from our organization, RTI. So Lisa and Chris Williams and Amanda Young, who have really been behind the scenes, been able to do this. Thanks for joining. Hopefully this will be informative. Hopefully you'll gain some information. Just a couple of things is I'm not the be all, the end all when it comes to the investigation of sexual assault, whether it's cold case or current case. There's many folks out there that are working these types of investigations that have more experience, knowledge, have dealt with situations different than what I have dealt with. And so I really appreciate everything that I've kind of learned from working with the Saki project. So I know that I see a lot in the chat box, a lot of familiar, I'd say faces, but it's names at this point when it comes to virtual. So a couple of things, we really haven't done this since 2015 when the project started. So we put out a basic investigation cold case webinar. And we kind of had some discussions over the past few months about, hey, we really need to kind of update that because there's been some different things and different areas that have really advanced and kind of freshen it up a little bit. So a lot of this you probably already understand and know and are practicing. That's great. That means you can sit back and say, hey, boss, I think we're doing things right because X, Y, and Z. Some of this information may be new, may be helpful. If you can take anything away and apply it to what you do on a day-to-day basis, that's kind of the goal that we have for this webinar. The kind of the caveat is if there's something in the webinar that violates your policy or practices, don't do it. Don't kind of stay away from that. There might be things like, hey, we can't do that as an organization, but I saw it on this webinar, and I'm going to go ahead and try it. But I don't want anybody to try to do something that would violate any of their policies or procedures or practices. But if you see something new and you want to present it and move it forward in your unit, that's kind of what we're here for. Kind of developing information, new ideas, practices. Trying to improve how we're responding to these cases. So there's a lot of discussion topics. We have several polls that we're going to be involved in. We're going to ask you. There's going to be some chat box information. And at the very end, time permitting, there's a couple of case studies. Well, there's a case study that I'd like to go through and apply what we talk about, what we heard, what we learned in the presentation to an actual case and see what that looks like, in real time for an investigator. So these are just some of the areas we're going to cover briefly in the first hour or so, and feel free to go get something to eat or drink or go to the bathroom as you need. Let's see if I can get this moving. I have a little technical thing here. There we go. Oops, my bad. So just want to do a little background. Most everybody that's involved in the SACI project, or if you're not, just kind of make you aware of this program. And honestly, I've been involved in a lot of grant projects, and this has been one of the most phenomenal programs that I've been able to associate myself with. So I was really excited when I was asked to join the RTI TTA team and become a part of that. Because really it's more than just handing somebody money and saying, okay, report every 4 months what you're doing, or every 3 months. And then at the end, make a final report. This is really accountability. This is really trying to support response change, not just with sexual assaults, and the evidence associated with it, but the whole agency or organizational response. And I think really it's really built a great foundation, and hopefully projects and grants in the future will kind of follow this practice of how this is more of an active accountability grant, as opposed to just having somebody have some money and then working through some of the issues as part of the grant. So at the very bottom, I'm going to refer a lot during this presentation to this TTA, the toolkit information. If I've information about the different SACI sites. Actually, that first slide, there's actually 71 SACI sites now with the new grant that just came out in October. So that needs to be updated, my bad. So what does it look like nationwide? Pretty much every state. One of our goals is to get in every state. So there are you see some gaps there that we're going to look for and try to push applications from those states. But we have state, city, county, multi-county, district, Washington, D.C. being the district. And there's, the funding is really phenomenal when you think about other programs. And so we anticipate or look at funding to continue as this project starts to expand into other areas as well. So what kind of impact has this had? Really, it's more than just testing the kits and then investigating the cases. A lot of states are implementing, and you're probably part of one of them, statutes that require inventories or audits, maybe annual audits, and that they reoccur. There's mandatory kit submission, which has never been a part of really any statute or sometimes even departmental policy. Many states are now involved. There's a part of the grant that provides funding to develop databases to track the kits. I think that's been a big issue when you ask how many unsubmitted kits do we have, and nobody really knows. And then mandatory training. We've seen several SACI sites emphasize this, and I think this is really the key that kind of builds on all those other responses and reforms that we see. So why does it matter? This is through June of 2020, so there's probably more current statistics, but for us, 130,000 SACs were inventoried by these 64, now 71 sites. You can see the different stats. How many CODIS hits? 11,000. Now these are 11,000 hits that would not have occurred without this project or without the folks working behind the project. Opened up 14,000 investigations. We're able to charge 1,500 cases in different jurisdictions and 862. And you think, okay, well, that kind of funnels down from how many kits we're testing and how many CODIS profiles we're getting. But honestly, I look at it this way. One case charge and one conviction is really what my goal was when we started our cold cases back in the early 2000s. And now we have 862. So think about the impact that has, not just with getting these offenders off the street, but what it can do to help heal the victims as they try to work through this. What's really been interesting about this project is some of the research that's come out of it. So this is, I keep using Detroit and Cuyahoga because they've been kind of the leaders, kind of the OGs when this practice started. And really, they looked at initially offenders and repeat offenders. And both of them came up with pretty much the same type of results from their analysis and their research, that about 40% of their offenders are serial offenders, serial sexual offenders. And that they offend against stranger and non-strangers, so they cross over. And then with Cuyahoga, 1/3 of the crimes committed by the serial offender occurred after the sexual assault that was tested in the Saki project. So there's a continuation of offending patterns and behaviors that we really need to be aware of when we're looking at these cases. We don't want to think myopically as this is just one case with one victim. There's a pretty good probability, I shouldn't say high probability, that this suspect is involved in other sex crimes. And we're going to talk about maybe other crimes that these offenders might be involved in. So this came out of both Wayne County Prosecutor's Office research and Case Western Begin Center, looking at serial sexual offenders, right? So they realize that they commit a high volume of crimes. So if you've been in law enforcement and you work a beat, you know there's 20% of the folks in your beat that are committing 80% of your crime, and you kind of knew who they were. Well, that's the same theory kind of here, right? So these offenders are really kind of tearing up our communities. They're not just doing sexual assault. They're generalists, as a term that was used by Case Western, that, you know, a lot of them are opportunities, whether it's a homicide, domestic violence, theft, drug offense, or a sexual assault. And, you know, they had the propensity to commit a sex crime. And so that's generally how they got involved in those cases. But when you look at the arrests, and these are just arrests based on Saki data and information about serial offenders and non-serial offenders. So serial sex offenders averaged almost 10 arrests in their, I guess, criminal career, right? And non-serial, you know, almost a third less at 6.6 arrests. So you know the propensity of a serial offender to commit additional crimes along with sex crimes. So one of the approaches we're looking at is how do we staff, how do we resource our sexual assault unit so we're able to identify these offenders early, right? And perhaps pull them out of what I call circulation. So they don't have the ability to commit additional crimes, victimize additional communities and neighborhoods. And so I look at it almost like a crime reduction strategy. And I know it sounds kind of weird, and I know you're thinking, how am I going to convince my chief and my leadership that if we invest in this sexual assault unit early on, there's a good probability that we can prevent other crimes from occurring with identifying these offenders. There's no guarantee, but I would certainly like to see that as part of a strategy that agencies are looking at to try to improve community safety, offender accountability, and prevent future victims. So what was interesting is out of Rachel Lovell and the research they did is they looked at the types of crimes that are being committed by Saki rapists, and you can see it runs the gamut here, right? And you would think, oh, well, probably rape was number one. Actually, when you look at it, a drug offense was the most common other crime committed by these offenders that were identified through Saki. But look at the variety of crimes. They're tearing up our communities, not just with sexual assault, but with these other crimes as well. And I think addressing this is really a key to help prevent. So, Lisa, I'll go to you. We have our first poll question for everybody. So the question is, how long have you been? I want to know what the audience demographics looks like. How long have you been investigating cold cases? So we got pretty good balance of folks that have just been exposed initially, and this might be maybe some of the first training they got, all the way up to 25, almost 25%. I've been doing it more than 5 years. So those are your OGs. Those are your experienced ones that probably, hopefully, as we go through this presentation, we can hear from them either in the chat box or talk to them about that. So that's good. So I think having a balance and the experience and skills that we see in our attendees is going to be really helpful for this success of this presentation. So I'm going to just talk about some of the foundations quickly as we go through some of these next slides. Let me see if I can get this thing to go forward. There we go. So, this is really a question that was asked when early on in Phoenix, when we were doing these cold cases, is not just the media, but grand juries, prosecutors who are unfamiliar with cold case sexual assault initially. How did they go cold? And so, prepare yourself to have some idea of how to answer these questions. And sometimes you just take ownership. Like, we know now, we have technology now, we understand these crimes better now than we did before. And so, yeah, we had policies in place that probably are, or were, not the best for sex crime investigation. So they went cold, right? And so having an understanding of why they may have gone cold, I think is important for you to develop this foundation of knowledge of why did you start looking at these cases. And I can't tell you how many times that I've been in court or I've had a grand jury. Why did you pick this up 10 years later? What's different now? And so these are some of the things to think about when you're working through that. So when you look at a crime scene, and I use this as, was this a homicide, a suicide, or accidental death? Did the donut maybe fall out of one of the windows on the second floor? But how are cold cases different than current cases? The passage of time, I think, is one of the big things to think about. How that impacts your victim, their recovery, where they are in life at this point, whether they want to engage or not. Your witnesses, are they alive? Are they dead? What do they remember? What don't they remember? Was there good documentation early on that we can use that in the case? And then evidence, right? Not just sexual assault kits, but we're looking at secondary evidence in a lot of these cases. But when you think about your current case, think about how what you're doing now is going to impact your case if it goes cold, if you can't resolve it right away. And I don't know any agency that has 100% clearance rate on their sexual assault. Generally, it hovers by national standards right around 40%. So, a lot of your cases are not being resolved, and down the road, we're going to be looking at these again. Due diligence and trust by the community and by victims that come forward. How did you handle these cases? Why do we have this backlog? Those kind of questions. And did you have the investigative skill set in the unit that could resolve these cases? And then pre-accusatory delay, statute of limitations, the process. I could tell you that you're probably going to be asked by a court, so you had this kit for 10 years. You've had DNA for at least 10 years. Why wasn't it tested earlier? When you got results, why weren't those results assigned and investigated right away? Why did you wait another 2 to 3 years? And so these are some of the questions that have come up and makes these cases a little more challenging or sometimes a little more difficult than current cases. So how are they the same? Well, the fundamental components of a sexual assault case don't generally change. You have offender behavior, victim targeting, victim isolation, victim compromising through alcohol or drugs, or you have marginalized victims, drug addicts, transients, maybe they're involved in prostitution and they're being targeted. So a lot of the same fundamental elements and components of current cases, how offenders behave, what they're going to say, consent or deny, how alcohol is a factor in a lot of these cases still. And then in known, where offenders were known to the victim, what's that a victim offender relationship? We're going to talk a little bit about that later on as well. It's interesting about solving these cases as well. So there was an NIJ study in 2007, and it was published in 2012, looking at 3 cold case units for homicide, and then Denver at the time had an active cold case sexual assault unit, and they looked at the solvability factors, right? So when you looked at the homicides and you looked at DNA matches, out of 100, the percentages are quite low if the homicide is going to be solved by DNA. But when you look at information from witnesses and from informants, that's how homicides are being solved. But then when you look at sex crimes and rape cases, and when you consider that we have, in a lot of cases, a sexual assault kit collected, which is the most probative and intimate samples that we can collect, we're solving most of our cases through a DNA match. And I don't have the breakdown of whether those were sexual assault kits or whether those were other pieces of evidence that were maybe submitted. So when you look at these 2 homicides, there's no consent. You don't really need the victim present. There's no statute. You look for the usual suspects. When it comes to sex crimes, consent is still going to be an issue in these cold cases, right? Is the victim engaged and available? Do they want to move forward? Can they move forward? And beyond the sexual assault kit, if the offender has a alibi of why his DNA is on the kit, do you have other supporting information and evidence that can either corroborate that statement or refute that statement? So there are statute issues, although many states are removing those. And then, offender identification and motive. It's very hard to understand the motive of a rapist, right? You may, in a homicide, see all kinds of motives with its gang, it's domestic violence, it's drug related, or a robbery, but it is very difficult to understand the motive sometimes in sexual assaults with offenders. So what are your first considerations? Is the case viable? Do we have a statute that's in play that we may have to be concerned about? Is the victim and the suspect even alive or deceased? So what kind of policies do you have in place that would direct you to identify those types of cases and whether they're viable or not, and kind of prioritize, especially when you're dealing with volumes of cases? What's the status of the original case? Was it cleared, closed, and founded? We're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. Was the suspect previously known? Is there a clear evidence chain? Are the items that were collected, can we establish custody of those items to get them into the court for a judge or jury to review as part of the case? And threat assessment. Is this offender potentially still active? We don't know who it is if we say have a case-to-case hit, or it's a stranger case and we finally get an identification. Where is that person? Are they still in our community? Are they in custody? Is there still a risk with that person reoffending? And we've seen, with the statistics, that that's a probability that may occur. So I want to talk a little bit about victim engagement. So let's fire up poll question 2. Do you have a victim notification and engagement plan? And that could either be, I prefer if it's in writing, like it's in a document, but if you have something that's a standard procedure that you work with your team on. So excellent. That's good to know, because I think this really is the foundation of what you might call success with these cases as an investigator or a prosecutor that's working on trying to hold the offender accountable. And I think it's really important to understand what kind of approaches. There's no right way or wrong way. There's different approaches with different individuals. And so I think this is really, really good to see. If you don't have a plan, there's many plans or examples of plans with other sites on the SACI TTA site. And so reach out if you're looking to develop something like that. So when you talk about contact and engagement, you have to consider the original event, how many years ago that was, and how the victim has been able to get control back in their life, how this has impacted them personally, professionally, family life, and consider what could happen when this is brought back up. And so all of those considerations that you need to think about, and that's why these notification plans not only direct operationally how you may do it, but also these other considerations, right? These cold cases feel like a current case. So be prepared. If if you're just an investigator and you're going out to make a notification, I would consider having some sort of advocacy with you. I think that's a best practice because there's going to be a situation that it's not related to the investigation. It's related to the victim, the survivor's well-being and where they are. And you maybe think you're prepared because you're going to do this great investigation, but there's other issues, other concerns that the victim really is focusing on other than this new case that's come back up for them. Do your research, especially in these cases where there's a known offender. Um, think about interviewing consideration. So that first contact engagement, probably not a good time if that original report lacks details or information, or there's questions that may be raised. You may want to do a comprehensive interview. We'll talk about that. But I would not consider that part of your initial contact and engagement. And so that has to be something, you know, as the investigation progresses that you would consider doing. And then continued support. How do we keep the victim in a viable case that we're moving forward, engage in the process? We had a cold case, we had a hit, and the offender was defending himself. He made 36 court motions in pre-trial. There were 27 trial dates firm that the victim was subpoenaed on. I'm sorry, after about the third or fourth subpoena for trial and it gets continued, I'm not sure how engaged I would want to be with this process, but God bless that victim that hung in there and wanted to see justice for herself and for the community, and was able to persevere through all of those issues with the court process. So when you think about notification, you know, these are just some questions to ask. Have a joint plan. When will you notify? Who is responsible? What information services can you or will you provide? And how will it take place? In person? Maybe with COVID, you're looking at other options through social media. I'm not saying good or bad, but consider, you know, that's a potential to work through some of these issues that you may have. So how does the trauma? We kind of talked a little bit about this. You know, a lot of the victims are marginalized from our marginalized communities, and I know we had cases where this put the victim back into a relapse or more substance abuse, and created, you know, putting them back where they were 10 or 15 years ago, where they were trying to, you know, work their way out of that situation. Is there a desire to move the case, not he case? Is there a desire to move the case forward? You know, what is justice for them? What is success for the victim and the survivor? What does that look like? Is it a prosecution, or is it acknowledgement that, hey, we're still looking at these cases, we're still interested in these cases, we hadn't forgotten about it, and that comes back to trust. And then maybe there's a safety issue, not having to look over your shoulder anymore about who's behind you, or was this a relationship that maybe they still have contact with the offender periodically. So those types of considerations and trauma impacting your case. So if you're considering re-interviewing, some questions you may ask is, do we have enough factual information in the original report to support a criminal charge? And I guarantee you, those that have been working these cases and doing case review, you're probably scratching and shaking and doing all kinds of things as you do these file reviews about the documentation or the lack of sufficient documentation. So there may be times that you need to kind of, I don't want to say clean up or shore up that initial statement. You know, and a lot of times victims have additional information that maybe they provided at the time, but it was never documented. Or maybe they didn't tell the investigator or the officer at the time because they were afraid, ashamed. And so you'd be surprised how much additional information you you can obtain just by asking the victim, what else, is there anything else in this investigation that occurred that, you feel it's important or we should know about? So I think it's really critical in a lot of cases, but it's something to consider. If you got a really solid initial interview, you know, um, you may not want to take the risk that that the information may be in confliction, and now you have you're going to go to court. And you're going to have to try to balance what a statement was 10 years ago with what the victim might be relating now. And there are ways to do that through experts, through memory recall, and those types of things. But something to consider. Did the statement now impeach what their original statement was? Was there something that wasn't mentioned? And you need to clarify that. A lot of times is, I didn't want to tell the officer, the detective, this. And that's something that you would be prepared to go to court and use as part of the case. I would say have the survivor decide the logistics. It's really interesting in the chat box seeing all the OGs like Rick Bell, Cuyahoga team, Kim Worthy out of Detroit. Um, you know, um, but one of the things that one of the investigators with the Cuyahoga Project, he said he did more interviews and engagement and contact with victims at the McDonald's than anywhere else. Right? So, having the victim decide time, place, location, giving them space to make that decision if they want to re-engage. I suspect that particular investigator had a couple of reasons for using McDonald's. One was because it was, non-confrontational, it was a neutral court. The other, I think he got the senior discount. So I think that was maybe driving part of his desire to go to McDonald's. And then assessing whether they can move forward, right? What kind of position are they in now that would not re-traumatize them or put them in a position where they just can't, they can't deal with this and with what's going on in their personal life or professional career as well. It's interesting out of Memphis when they started tracking their cases on their backlog, and really where were their victims, where were issues that might come up at the case, and so they had a pretty low percentage. So 11% the victim or suspects were deceased. So this is an anticipation of when you're going through these cases that this is going to occur. And really low, unable to locate victims, only 3%. And this is an early statistic from 2015. So I don't know how much that changed, because I know that's a challenge, is trying to do research and locate victims and witnesses. Very challenging, very time consuming. So Lisa, if you want to put up poll number 3. What experience do you have investigating rape cases? Not just cold case, but response cases or hot cases, however you want to describe that. Because as we talk about the difference and the similarities between response and cold cases, there's just a fine line. There's some nuances, but a lot of them, if you have the experience with hot cases, that can be very helpful. All right, getting the results. Okay, so we have, and it's 47% more than 2 years. I kind of use the draw at 2 years when investigators are coming to the unit. They were like a lost puppy at the shelter trying to get adopted. It's a whole new experience with the dynamics and the nuances of rape cases. And I said, give yourself 2 years to feel comfortable with how these cases develop, working with victims and survivors, physical evidence, DNA, follow-up, crime team. A lot of investigators came from other investigative units and go, within a month, they said, I've never experienced this type of investigation. So if you have an opportunity to work hot and response cases, I would suggest doing that. Get some experience, get some understanding, get that, get those nuances in relationship with how these cases are developed. So let's move on to kind of put in how to organize and manage your information in your case and the work you're doing, because you're doing a lot of good work. You want to make sure that gets documented accurately. You want to make sure that if you don't solve the case today, 5 years from now, somebody might be able to. And so, just some ideas to think about. Many of you are probably already doing this type of work in organization. Many of you have probably gone through, well, how do we investigate and prioritize these cases? So we talked about some of the considerations. Could this be related to a serial offender? Always think yes. Do you know what your laboratory capacity is if you're going additional pieces of evidence or crime scene information that you want them to process? And then the community data. So looking at prioritizing not only the cases that you may be initially opening up that book and looking at and reviewing, but when you get CODIS hits. And if you like a lot of these jurisdictions, the floodgates open up and pretty soon you're having double-digit CODIS hits in a month. And if you're like most of us, you didn't have the manpower to effectively assign resources to each one of those hits. So you had to prioritize and organize your cases and be defendable. Like, why was this case chosen over these other cases? And you may get that question from your survivor. Why were these other cases being investigated? Mine was sitting dormant, sitting stagnant. But if you apply consistent practices and practical tools to every case, you can defend your practices. I would say, look at your policies, not just for response, but for cold case. Are those best practices? Are we giving enough information to the folks in our organization to be able to effectively manage, investigate, resolve these cases? And I put that on first line leaders, your sergeants, your lieutenants, your commanders that are sitting over these units. Those are the things they need to provide support and resources for the worker bees that are doing this type of work. This is something that came, just an example, out of Tucson. So they tiered everything when they started classifying, and some of this is based on we know that the serial offenders are going to continue offending, right? So that might be more danger to the community. But I would also argue that a suspect, an offender that knew the victim and it was a domestic violence situation, I would argue that they're almost as dangerous in that situation than a stranger. And so, but at least it has some way of organizing your process. Somebody coming new into the unit can understand this system. And you have a supervisor with some oversight looking at this process. The other little graph is a match. Like, so what if we do get some sort of a CODIS hit? How do we assess and start to investigate those cases? You'd like to do them all at once. I remember one month, I think we had 65 CODIS hits from our cold case team, and we had one detective. I had to pick up 3 guys from the YMCA to help us out to investigate these cases. So we actually came up with a point system. It's very simple, very basic, and so that helped us kind of organize to some degree. Doesn't mean we followed that to the letter of the prioritization, but it gave us kind of a foundation to look at. So what's your responsibility, right? Don't wait for the lab. If you're looking at a case and you're submitting evidence, or you have a sexual assault kit that you want to submit, or you're waiting for results to come back, be active. Start creating a checklist. Start looking at your to-do. Start developing a strategy or an approach of what you're going to do in this case. Because if you don't get information back from the lab for 5 years, and that case is set dormant for 5 years, I'm going to ask you, what have you done in the 5 years that you had this case assigned to you? And even if it is, I did research to identify location of the victim and these 2 witnesses, I was able to send a postcard or go to a location to try to locate this witness. I reviewed the evidence that has been impounded for this crime. Document that. That's activity. That shows that you're making progress to investigate this case. You haven't just forgot it and sat it on a shelf. So you need to gather all the information. You need to get that strategy or that approach. Coordinate your case activities. If you have case-to-case hits with other jurisdictions, or you have other investigators doing cold case, or you have a current case unit, a lot of these cases are going to link to current suspects that are offending now, that are out on the street. Make sure you archive, document, and manage your information. And of course, have an approach, have a strategy, have an understanding of what you're going to do in the next steps in these cases. Just a little quick display or visual of, a CODIS hit and what the process might look like. So I think the most important thing is once there's notification to your unit, to wherever that notification is going, whether it's an email, get that case assigned to somebody. Make somebody responsible for that information. Don't 5 years down the road pull the desk drawer open from a retired investigator and find 25 CODIS hits in there, right? That there's been no action on it. So that's really a key to creating more trust and accountability with how we are investigating not only these cases but other cases. So review the hit, right? Was it to an offender? Review the file, review the offender's history, create that plan. Think about if you don't have an victim engagement or notification process, what's going to be the best approach after you do some research. How are we going to contact the offender? Do we go out right away and arrest them? I mean, I've seen some discussion about doing that. I think we need to take more of an analytical approach, organizing your case, and then, man, you have to defend this and take it to court if that's our goal and the outcome that we're looking and striving for in these cases. So just these are off the webpage, the TTA webpage. Organizing your file, some common case file documents that you might want to have in there. It'd be nice if an investigator could come, grab your case file, open it up and say, oh, here's everything that's in here. Here's things that are missing. Okay, I know where to go to get the scene report. I know where to look to see if there's a suspect interview, or are there crime scene supplements or information about the crime scene. I was kind of tagged at the 3 Ps when you're organizing your file. So you have a people or a person that are associated with the case, whether that's the survivor, witnesses, outcry witnesses, offenders, investigative leads, and then you have the paper. All the documentation from laboratory reports to SANE reports to crime scene diagrams to search warrants, to court orders, all that in a location. And then you have your property, right? What do we have in our case? If it's just a sexual assault kit, you indicate that. If there's other things, what is the status of that evidence? Where is it at? What can we do anything? So just some common things that are in those reports to think about when you're organizing your case or your file for explaining to somebody, whether it's your SACI team or whether you're going to the prosecutor presenting this case to get charges filed or a grand jury. I was old school. We bought kind of a library cabinet, and we kept all of our hits in hard copy books because paperwork tends to get misplaced, gets lost. So I could actually go up, pull a book off the shelf and look at that book and see, okay, well, what's going on in this case? Where is it in a priority? Is this case related to other cases? And then who are the people involved, and what is the property that I have? That was me. May or may not work with you to do the hard copy stuff because everything's electronic, but it certainly helped us when we were trying to organize, and then somebody would leave the unit. So we would have these CODIS hits sitting on a shelf, and we were accused of just letting them sit there. So we tried to work them as best we could. So just what the hit book might look like, how you might prioritize those cases, and who has access to those case files. And that was very helpful in organizing how we approached a lot of our cases. The other thing is a lot of the testimony that we were required to give, either as a grand jury or explaining to a prosecutor or in court, is what's your timeline? You know, when was the original incident? And I think knowing dates and times and even locations is critical for you as the master of this case, the investigator who knows all, sees all, and does all with these investigations, right? So understanding, when was this case originally assigned? Who was it assigned to? When was it closed, if it was closed? And was there a rationale for closing it? When did this get revitalized? When did this get picked up again? When was it reviewed? Why was it reviewed? How was it reviewed? What evidence did you then pick up and move to the next level, whether it was submitting it to the lab, whether it's just seeing if we still had it in the property room? And then based on that evidence, when did you get any results from the lab, date and time? Because if you got it in January of 2015, and there's no activity on the case till December of 2017, somebody's going to want to know what happened in between all of those dates, right? And having that information, especially here in Arizona, where we use the grand jury process, there's a lot of grand jury questions about this, you know, dates, times, locations, and then what follow-up did you do on this case to get us to this point? So looking at the timeline and understanding those marks in the timeline that are significant in this investigative file, to give those who don't understand kind of a look at the process and how you proceed in these types of cases. So here's some support documents and information that you'll have access to when we PDF this presentation for later use. But some of it are things that you may use, you know, in your state or have access to, but some of it is off our webpage. So these are some things, just reminders of areas where you can gather information and do research on. So what about the file review? I think this is really important. Understanding how to review a file, whether you're doing it individually or as a team. You have to have a base knowledge of what should an investigation look like and what does this look like? And sometimes it's easier said than done, right? But if you have an experience and you have an understanding of these cases and things that should be occurring in a current investigation, when you open up this old file, are those elements present, right? So I think this is really a foundational step when you're looking at this. So you need to assess, honestly, the type and quality of investigation. You could probably look at the investigator's name that's attached to the file, and you could probably make a determination of what kind of case that you have, whether it's a solid, all the I's are crossed and the T's are dotted, or there's some gaps, there's some information that's going to be missing or that we need to try to address. So what was the type and quality? What follow-up was completed? How was that document? Are there things that were missed? And yeah, there's going to be things in every case. Every case that I ever investigated, you could probably take that file and go, why didn't you do this? Why did you do that? So what we want to try to do is use fresh eyes, new understandings of the complexity of these cases, how offenders offend, how victims are targeted, right? But also understand what kind of biases and influences we have as individuals on rape cases, right? How we perceive these cases from when we came out of the academy to the first rape call that we went out on, right? So assessing that and understanding some of the information that's documented is really important. And I think that's one of the things we've seen across jurisdictions in some of our assessments that we're doing is the minimal documentation. And I know we're taught just the facts, but I think when you look at these cold cases, there's the, oh, I wish we would have had this information, or I wish we would have had that information. So what are just some standards for reviewing these files? You know, pretty fundamental. Hopefully in your current cases, they're pulling 911 tapes and keeping those as evidence. If you're fortunate and you have that in a cold case, if you're fortunate and you have photographs of a crime scene or a location, a lot of these cases, there was minimal follow-up. And so you're kind of going from scratch, where you may have to go out and take some pictures of a scene or a location. So when you're talking about evaluating the written documentation, Be careful of the language that was used. Maybe typical to see uncooperative. What does that mean? Unfounded. We know what UCR and what clearance standards are for unfounded, but sometimes those are used liberally. Words like unbelievable or previous opinions that we're supposed to keep out of the investigation. And how accurate is that documentation? I just, as part of one of the early projects, the city of Houston had an action research project in 2010 to look at almost 8,000 unsubmitted rape kits. They wanted to look at factors that may have influenced that kit of why it wasn't submitted. So of the 493 untested kits, 79% of them had an identified suspect that was never interviewed. I think as an investigator, that's one of the key aspects of a complete investigation. Now, there may be reasons why that didn't occur, and they may be good reasons why. 82% of the cases had no crime scene investigation. Even if you don't believe there was valuable evidence, DNA or otherwise, at the scene, the value of going and observing a scene to corroborate or refute statements from witnesses, from suspects, from survivors is really important. And I think when you get to the case where the case might be going into trial, it's a real possibility they're going to ask why you didn't go to a crime scene. And to say, oh, I didn't think it was important or I didn't have time, usually not acceptable in the eyes of most jurors or judges. And then also they found documentation about victim credibility. So they basically didn't believe the victim, right? This is an incredible story, right? I can't prove this because I don't believe what happened. They're not credible. They were on drugs. They were drunk. They're a transient. They're involved in some sort of other illegal activity. So why am I going to bother putting effort towards investigating this case when I know their credibility is probably what people are going to view, either in the court system or other professionals in the criminal justice system. This is some of the things you've probably seen in some of your investigations. Hadn't really done an investigation, but with questioning, inactivating these cases is because one of the reasons is because instead of walking to a nearby location, the victim walked to their sister's house who took her to the hospital. Can you understand why in a traumatic situation, being a victim of one of these crimes where you may not think of knocking on a stranger's door to try to get help, but you knew where your sister lived and I'm going to walk there because I know I'm going to get support and safety. And then of course you want to close the case because right before the incident, the victim had intercourse with her boyfriend. So that would null any sort of rape allegation that the victim's trying to make against somebody, right? And of course, there's no evidence proving the incident occurred or leading to a suspect. Sorry, I think that's the definition of a detective. Isn't that your responsibility to objectively, unbiasedly look at an incident and determine whether the facts and circumstances of the case can prove a crime occurred? That's your job. Just other things to look for. There's probably a million examples out there. I don't know if anybody has the practice of advising a victim prior to the full interview that it was a crime to make a false report to the police. Think about opening up that cold case and now approaching that victim, that this is how the interview started with them. So what's their expectation of what's going to happen now, right? So you, as they said on the I Love Lucy show, Ricky, you may have some splaining to do, right? Because that's going to be a tough hurdle to kind of trying to get over, to get trust and engagement with the victim when some of these previous communications and interactions were just awful. Not all of them, not forever. So when you think about current cases, think about these interactions and how they impact the cases later on. Always consider that a lot of these interactions and the way investigators or detectives or officers in the past assumed things and applied this assumed logic that was faulty and ultimately came up with a faulty analysis of the case and ultimately closing the case without further investigation. So there's ethnic, gender, crime stereotypes. There's personal opinions and biases. Sometimes that anchor effect, if you're familiar with that. This is what I believe happened in the case, and there's nothing going to change my opinion about what happened. I still believe that this didn't occur the way the victim's disclosing. But there's also other things to consider. What was the past climate and the culture within your organization? What does it look like now? What sort of detectives were investigating these cases and investigators? What was their workload, caseload, policies that were in place that they were following that maybe weren't best practices, right? And other influences that might have been a part of that. So just some resources to potentially look at off the TTA website, kind of investigative checklists, specialized investigative skills. There's also an activity, a virtual academy where you can walk through a cold case. It does take some time and commitment, but if you have the opportunity, I think it's really dynamic. It is interactive. It does require you to identify information and practices and then apply those into a case. I just want to briefly go over crime scene, but let's talk about poll number 4 here. So this is for current case, and I go back to, kind of that Houston research. In your current cases, how often is sexual assault crime scene processed? And, realistically, every case has, a lot of people say, well, the victim's your crime scene. That's all you got to worry about. But I would argue clearly there are locations, there are places, there are things that are also associated with these investigations that, in my opinion, are a crime scene. Whether it's they run to the Circle K and they talk to the clerk and there may be video. So how often are these scenes processed by either you or your organization? Okay, I see in the chat box 25% is too high. Never is too low, so they're in the 5. So they're on the low side. They're in the 5%. Interesting. Thanks, Derek. And either processed by patrol or a sex crime detective or a crime scene unit. I see that question in there. So yeah. Okay, so we're about 50%. I mean, I would like to see 100%. I think those of you that have dove into these case files wish that it was 100%. Because I'm sure you got questions about, hey, the victim said that X, Y, and Z was in the scene, and you don't have any way to prove or disprove that. And so you're based in, you don't disbelieve the victim, but gosh, isn't it nice to be able to corroborate some of that information? I always ask my prosecutor, just out of curiosity, how much evidence is too much evidence for your case? And of course, the response was, you can never have too much evidence in these cases, especially in the day and age of CSI and all these television shows. So, hey, thanks for the responses on that. So, what are some areas for secondary evidence? Let me see if I can get my screen to move forward. Was the original scene even worked? What actions were taken? Did they write a supplement? A lot of times I went to the scene, I conquered the scene, and I left, right? And you have no information about what actually functions or things they perform. If you have a good crime scene unit, they're going to write you a 1 or 2 page supplement. I would emphasize doing that when you're processing these cases. Find pictures. Look, we kept our photographs 35 millimeter in a separate section of our information unit. We get a call one day that says, hey, we've got all this film, negatives and everything from all these sexual assaults. We're going to get rid of them because nobody uses them anymore. We had to actually stop and grab those things from our information unit to say, nope, we will take those. You'd be surprised how many photographs we got from crime scenes that we didn't think we had. Was there additional evidence collected? Is it available? What condition is it in? Has it been documented? Is there a chain of custody? Has the lab looked at any of this information? Are there photographs tying that evidence to the crime scene? It sure helps when you go to court, when you look at those things. We were destroying evidence right in the middle of our cold case process, investigation team. You would get a purge from the property room. Hey, the statute of limitations, there's been no activity on this case. We're asking you, do you want this evidence destroyed? We were destroying evidence. We had to put an emergency standard operating procedure. Stop it. Any evidence in sexual assault cases, please never destroy. We eventually got policy in place, and now state law, that if there's DNA evidence associated with a sex crime or homicide, you have to keep it 55 years. So think about that. Don't let other investigators who maybe have other cases that you're not assigned start to look at their evidence, and because the property room says, we got to clear this stuff out. We're taking in X amount of stuff. We need to get rid of X amount of stuff. So really take a hard look at that. And what are some additional options for testing or for the crime scene that you may have? And then maybe have somebody do a crime scene analysis. I know the FBI has profilers that kind of look at this. If you've got good experience, you can get a feeling for a crime scene. I would recommend going out and visiting these crime scenes if you have the ability to do that. Look at the area, look at the surroundings, look at how the suspect may have been able to identify the victim at this location and how they're able to isolate them and commit this crime. I say you have to do that. And then finding evidence. So this was real briefly, this was a kidnapping where the victim was put into a van that she was cleaning and then taken to another location, sexually assaulted. A DNA hit came back 5 years later, identifying from the sexual assault kit this suspect. He was arrested. He went to court. He actually testified that it was a consensual encounter the night before with this victim. That's why you have my DNA in the sexual assault kit. And by the way, in that van that you seized, that you removed the back seat from, that had that stain, that's actually the real suspect's DNA in that van. I was never in the van. Well, guess what? We had never tested that. The upside is that seat was still in property. The downside is 5 to 7 years later, we had never looked at that. So there was an effort to try to get that tested. The judge said, you've had enough time to look at this. We're not going to let you test it and stop the trial just to get that information into court. So the jury did convict, but they didn't convict on the kidnapping because they wanted to know whose DNA that was on the seat. And they doubted that it was the suspects. So crime scenes are tricky. I'm going to play a little video here about what can go wrong at a crime scene.
We've got a perfect threat here. We really need this to tie the suspect to the scene. Well, who's the case agent on this? Buck Savage. Buck who? Savage. Buck Savage.
I always chuckle if those of you that are familiar with Buck Savage and some of the videos that were done here in Arizona. So, little chat box. How do you prioritize evidence for laboratory submission? Just give me what you do in the chat box if you have an opportunity. And then we're going to talk about evidence in crime scenes. Our lab decides based on SANE, based on what they've, based on the medical report, examination report. Also look at secondary evidence, statute of limitations, age of the victim. Send it all. Let them work it out. I bet you they love that when you send them 30 items. Interesting though. Yeah, they do have some policies. That's really interesting about sexual assault examination kits and other items. So it's a good conversation. If they're not part of your team or you don't communicate with them regularly, you really should find out what is your practice. What are your capabilities? Can you do this sort of extraction or examination? And how many items do you want me to send you, right? That you can manage. And so now you're prioritizing which items are important, which items aren't important. So the SAC first. Okay. Yep. Good. Thank you. Good information. Okay. See if I can get my, so back. So when you look at this particular scene, and this was in an apartment the victim's apartment where the suspect had broken in, and when the victim came home, um, he assaulted her. So this is only about half of the items of evidence that we were able to recover. I'm just curious, and you can use the number of slide. So what would be the top 3 items that you would identify? The victim was that you would submit. The victim was able to say in number 5 that those are items that the suspects brought. Picture number 7, it was something that was identified on the side wall. Could be blood. Don't know until it gets tested. Number 6 is an item that the suspect used to restrain and tie the victim up. She was wearing this like a coat coverall. Picture 2 is where the assault occurred. 3 is the screen the suspect used to make entry into the apartment. All of it. God bless Shane that you got a lab that'll take all of that. Item number 4, items that were discarded in the garbage, or picture number 4, discarded in a garbage can that might be where the suspect wiped himself off. I see looks like some sort of towel or something in there. Masking tape was used partially to restrain the victim. Shoes, sandals, whatever you want to call those, were not the victims. So the sack first, that's where the hit came from. 2, okay, 7, 5, 7, 4, yeah. So, but these are things to think about, when you get to a crime scene and when you look at the potential for identifying who the offender is and how long is it going to take for this stuff to be processed, will the lab do this? We were fortunate in this case. This was a kidnapping, and we had to prove to the lab that this Pepsi can that we wanted to process on a cold case was actually part of the original investigation. And thank goodness that our patrol officers had actually taken pictures of the location of where this kidnapping and attempt sexual assault occurred. So I think we got a poll question coming up, it looks like. How do you get notified from your crime lab of results? I think communication, cooperation, collaboration is really important. And I'm just curious to see what methods are being used to give you this information, whether it's on a current case or in particular on these cold cases, results from evidence that they tested. Oh, iResults is it's a web-based laboratory information system that you can access to look at lab results that they put in there. If they have a LIM system, an information system that allows them to put that data, and then investigators and others can go into iResults, this website, and look at results from evidence. So most folks are getting an email or a letter in the mail or iResults, good, or a phone call, okay. I think identifying who's responsible, you're not sending a postcard to an investigator that retired 10 years ago. I think that's really important, and so that's good to see the different ways of doing it. You get a CODIS lab report, read it. Might not be the easiest thing to read, might not be something to sit and have a glass of wine with, but you need to look and interpret what they're telling you and what you may learn from that lab report and what you can do next. Because there's a good possibility it's going to be very difficult to get that DNA analyst or fingerprint analyst on a phone to talk you through the report. What type of hit is it? Is it a case to case? Is it to the offender who was originally identified? And then evaluating the offender. What do we need to do immediately? What are some things we can do? What are some ongoing strategies tragedies. Does this information move the case? Is it from the sexual assault kit, but it's from, say, a breast swab, where you can't show nothing from the vaginal swabs or penetration, which would show, the crime of sexual assault. So this was a typical lab report that we would get in our unit. And if you don't have somebody that can explain this to you, you may be in a situation where you're trying to figure out, what does this mean to me in my investigation? I talk about the SANE report. Hopefully everybody is getting a copy of the medical examination report. It's identifying injuries, what was collected, what was documented. Having that and reviewing that, looking at the statement that perhaps the survivor, the victim, gave to the SANE nurse, and are there some conflictions with the statement you have? Is it possibly that you may have to kind of clarify some of that information? But I think it's really important to have. I'm just going to skip through some of these pictures. So DNA and what else? I mean, can we link this case otherwise through an offender? How do we try to do that? Are we doing crime analysis, not just with this case, but looking at other cases that might be related, because we know these offenders are involved in other crimes? Looking at crime scene pictures. Those pictures on the right were the suspect's shoe impression. We found those at other crime scenes. But what he was doing was, there was an olive tree, and olives were coming off the tree, and he was stepping on them, and it was creating this impression from his shoe. So we were actually linking cases before we were getting DNA back. And so I think looking at some of these crime scene pictures and maybe how they are related to other crime scenes is really important too. We were going to do a chat box on this, but I think we'll skip through this. But always consider these things, right? So were there consensual partners that you may have to contact and try to get a DNA sample to eliminate them as part of the person that you may be identified through the DNA completed by the lab? Was this case previously looked at by the prosecutor or submitted? And what were the results of that particular action? Is there still electronic or social media evidence available? Were there search warrants or previous suspect contacts? And then how do we manage the media in these cases when, if we're making an arrest, it's gonna go to the media. They're gonna see the booking slip. They're gonna see the charging, and maybe you want to say, hey, this is a success we're having with this particular program. So offender hit follow-up, do the case review, do your analysis, and then communication with prosecutors, other investigators about what your approach is going to be. Always be concerned about backlog 2.0. We've submitted all our evidence. The crime labs is analyzing and doing testing. And now we're getting these hits backs, and it's just overwhelming us, right? What's our process in place? What practices do we want to follow? How can we justify doing certain actions or not certain actions? How do we explain, where we are in the process? And I think that's really important, but I made it red, do something, right? And again, it can be as simple as just writing a note in the file. So, I go back to one of the original slides about, it is never a bad thing to reevaluate your case, what you know, what you don't know, what are some challenges that you may have, what is the potential of this case actually moving into the criminal justice system, or do I need additional information to let it progress? Have there been conflicts with witnesses and survivors and maybe even offenders' original statements that we could resolve through a further investigation? And are there patterns, are there geographical locations that we can link this case to other offenders by? And, have your team involved in these decisions. If you don't have identified prosecutors who have a skill set or knowledge about these cases, provide information for them, especially if you've been doing these for a while. Hey, these are some of the issues that we're gonna run into. And then just remember about the cognitive bias when you're doing case review. I'm just gonna, finish up with some offender information and some things to think about. Focusing on offenders in sexual assault cases, I think, is something that over the last few years, we've really started to address, as opposed to looking at how bad the victim is, what are some issues with credibility, what are they involved in. Let's look at offenders who are targeting these, right? Let's look at their history, what type of relationships they may have been in. You may have a criminal history, and you may start pulling old police reports where they're suspects or they're witnesses or they're victims in other cases. And you can kind of get an idea of who this offender is, right? And how they identified this victim, how they accessed, what the isolation was. Did they use any sort of method to make the victim vulnerable through alcohol or drugs? And we see a lot of those cases that drugs are involved. And then who was in control during the course of this assault? Interpersonal violence, I think that's really important. A lot of these offenders, as you saw in the statistics, are involved in these other crimes, including domestic violence or interpersonal violence or relationship violence, however you want to describe it, right? And so looking at that, looking at their history, pulling all that up, analyzing it, reading those reports, and I know it takes time, but you're really going to get a good idea of who this offender is. And then when you approach them, what that's going to look like when you start to talk to them. So what's the nature of the assault? Was it a stranger? Did they use a ruse? Did they approach the victim and offer something? Or was this a relationship where they knew the offender, they worked with them, they had a relationship with them, an intimate relationship, or it's a family member? So what are the known facts about the nature of this type of assault? And then what evidence do you have? What's your timing? When are you going to try to interview folks, identify the suspect, bring him in, use interview approach? When are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? And then consider what defense the suspect is probably going to throw at you. So you need to be prepared for that. So again, looking at the timeline of some of these cases, what's the strategy for a stranger? We kind of talked about the different approaches when you're looking at these stranger rapes. What can happen when it's a non-stranger case, and what maybe are the nuances or the differences in those types of cases when you're looking at what your strategy might be? Would it be based on physical evidence or the SANE exam? Or would it be more looking at the relationship and how this just fell into that domestic violence relationship where there are other incidents of domestic violence occurring as well, which we know does happen. I'm going to keep moving forward. So I'm just going to go briefly through a warm hit where don't disregard these cases, right? Where the offender was identified originally in the report, because were they ever interviewed? How were they identified? What relationship was there between the victim, the survivor, and the suspect in these cases? I can tell you that maybe there was no sexual assault kit that was performed, but you still can gather and obtain intelligence and information by reaching out to your victim. And I know you think, well, this case probably is not going to move forward, but a good friend of mine that was doing cold cases with the Tempe Police Department here, cold case sexual assaults, had a lot of cases where there was minimal evidence or none, but there was a relationship between the victim and the suspect. There was a debate of whether we should even introduce this new investigation to the survivor and the challenges with that. But he decided to do that. He said in a vast majority of these cases, he actually obtained additional information from talking to the victim that was not in the original report, that they didn't provide perhaps to the original officer or the investigator. but now gave him leads and potential additional facts and intelligence that he said, hey, I've got some cases I think I can move forward. One particular instance where, hey, I was told after my sexual assault by X, Y, and Z that this suspect also assaulted them. I think that's pretty powerful if you can get other victims that are willing to provide you information. And that was just because there was nothing that he could see investigatively to move the case forward except talking to the victim. So don't just trash these cases. Don't look at them and say, I can't move this forward. Think about investigatively, if I did talk to the victim, can I gain information and intelligence that may move this case forward? You know, are there linkages? What sort of relationships were there? Victim contact, you know, are there other options? You know, maybe a confrontation or a controlled phone call. Can this case be used in other situations? You know, maybe the suspect's up for parole or he's on probation, and maybe the probation officer or the parole board would consider this in this offender's history. So we have another poll that we want to do. And we're getting close to our hour and a half time. So I really appreciate everybody hanging with us. So talking about pretext or control phone calls, how many have you actually used? And this in definition is where law enforcement provides the victim or a witness the opportunity to make a phone call or communicate through social media with the suspect in order to gain additional information or facts about this case. And in these cold cases, would it be an option 5 or 10 years later that the victim would be able to call or interact with the suspect, you know, and say, hey, you know, I'm still struggling with what happened 5 years ago, you know, whatever kind of theme you want to try to use, but there's a lot of themes. I would encourage to look for our TTA team is actually putting together some tools and some training on using these particular types of calls, both in cold cases and even more so in current cases. So just a consideration. Yeah, we had a 20-year-old cold case where the offender was, I should say, a religious figure, and the victim was a juvenile at the time of the offense, 20 years prior. And the victim made a phone call, was able to locate the suspect, and the suspect made a full admission as to their involvement in the assault of this victim 20 years ago. And that was recorded, and that was used in the prosecution of that particular suspect. So I'm telling you, just consider it as a potential option when you're thinking about those things. I think we're just going to keep moving forward in the investigation. We have about 5 minutes. And look, I'm not the best suspect interviewer. I'm not the worst. I've learned a lot. I've seen a lot. I practice a lot with interviewing folks in different types of cases. So I'm just going to kind of go over some thoughts and ideas when you're confronting the suspect. This should be your goal. This should be the final goal. This should be, hey, this is what I want to get in that room, and I want to talk to this person. I've done all this investigative background. And a lot of us have been through a lot of these different trainings that I see listed here. I say there isn't really one training that I would consider like, you know, the gold standard. I think each one of these trainings offer significant assistance and ideas and approaches for interviewing suspects. And, you know, a lot of it depends on you and your style, the type of crime that occurred, the offender that's involved in the case. But creating, you know, a plan for how you're going to interview the suspect, I think is really critical. And you should be thinking about that a lot of times from the very beginning. You know, be prepared, understand this offender and the type of crime, because they were there potentially. They know what happened. right? You want to make sure you have a conducive environment. You use a cognitive. If you haven't done research on cognitive approach, it's like, tell me what happened, and you let them give you a narrative if you're in that position where you can do that. Don't be confrontational. We're finding that that's in a lot of the studies and a lot of the research they're looking at, that's a good way to shut your offender down. And then how do you use your evidence in your case? How do you present that when you're interviewing that? I just want to play this really quickly. This was a serial sexual assault suspect. And the investigator in this case had done a lot of background and research. And this is when he's kind of telling the offender about what he knows about him.
Tell me what's going on in your mind and what makes you do these things. It's okay to cry. Go ahead. I've had people cry before. I know. And you didn't go because you were wanted. You couldn't go there, and you wanted to be there. I know you did. It's okay to cry. I got kids that haven't seen in 10 years. Yes, 3 of them, correct. And your wife's name's Mary. And then there's Isabel. Yeah. Go ahead and cry. Because I'm telling you.
So, you know, when you consider all the information that investigator already knew about this person, so you're halfway there. This isn't, you know, just coming in and saying, did you do it or didn't you do it? This is, hey, I did an investigation. This is what I know about you. And then the suspect's thinking, well, what else do they know? What other information, what other evidence might they have that they're going to confront me with? So think about themes, legal props. Be careful with creating some sort of a laboratory report that says the suspect's DNA was found on X, Y, and Z. That might be a dangerous approach that that might be considered, you know, potentially not legal to use that type of approach. Threats, promises, anything like that when you're dealing with these interviews. So options for a suspect: denial, I don't remember; consent. If you've had consent, there are some practices, and everybody's going to have an opportunity to get these slides and this information so they can look at, review it. And I'm also available to be a resource, and so is the whole TTA team. So I'm kind of, the last thing I want to go over is the use of evidence. So typically we wanted to push hard and get a confession. But with DNA in a lot of these cases, is it good enough to get a denial and then stop and say, okay, they denied knowing this person, their DNA, let's go to the court and let them try to explain how this DNA got on a particular person. So how do you present it? When do you present it? And how that offender, you know, reacts to it. And I'm just a real quick clip with cold case, DNA linked to the sexual assault kit. Here's where
Crime I'm looking at is sexual assault and kidnapping, which occurred February 2nd, 1992. That's not me. Do you see this chair here? What's on that chair? Okay. That's the telephone cord and it's a telephone cord that's in evidence right now in the Phoenix Police Department. That's the same cord. I just took this photo to show that. Do you recognize this?
So when you talk about props, when you talk about having information about your crime, it's just photographs of crime scene. And the suspect is denying. And so it's pretty specific what you're asking them about, and it's pretty specific that they're denying that. So, you know, think of that as a potential approach that you can use, you know, when you're talking to these offenders. So do we have a second chance in these cases? Yeah, absolutely. You know, accept what happened with these cases, what good, bad, otherwise. It's an opportunity to engage and support survivors and bring trust and credibility back to your organization or your department. For me, it was always, we could put a bad guy in jail. And I think we learn from our past. We learn from our history. We don't have to repeat ourselves. We can put policies and practices in place that will improve how we're doing things for the future. So I'm going to stop with that. I don't know if anybody's still on board. I apologize for going a couple minutes over, but are there any questions that you may have that you want to, put in the chat box? Cassandra asked, doesn't on confrontations control calls, doesn't the victim have the victim doing the call? Yes. But if you have a witness or somebody that could potentially understand what's going on with the investigation, they could be used too. Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. These are my contact information. I want to thank the support from here at RTI for allowing this presentation to occur. I apologize we didn't get to the case study. I want to apply some of the methods and some of the things we talked about to that, but maybe at a future date, we can do a couple case studies and we can get everybody back on the line. And I really appreciate staying engaged and supporting, your victims, your community, your agency, and, don't ever get discouraged. The work you do is important. You may think like you're just spinning your wheels, but you're really making a difference. And we really appreciate the fact that we have 71 sites now and looking for more that are addressing not only the unsolved sexual assault kits, but other issues surrounding sexual violence and interpersonal violence. So I don't know if my RTI folks.
Yes, thank you so much, Jim. We really appreciate your time today and all of this information that you've shared with us. And we will archive this within a few business days, and we'll send out an email announcement to all who have registered, and you'll receive a recording of the presentation today as well as a copy of the slides. And we will also post it on the Saki TTA website. So again, thank you all for your attendance, and thank you so much, Jim. We really appreciate you.